Welcome to another episode of New Wine UnCorked, and I'm stoked to be here this morning with fellow New Wine advisory board members, as well as New Wine participants and church leaders. Tony Huyhn, you see, well, on my screen, he's to my, right there, and Phil Berlin is on the bottom there. So each one of us has worked and served, to Tony currently now, but served as pastors on staff at local churches. And so today's conversation is going to be stepping into that idea and truth of the church's role in today's culture, especially in light of focusing on social media. And so, Tony, just the other day, you posted something which I found fascinating on your Facebook page, relating a story about 230 members of a church and the infection of COVID-19 and this spread, which we've seen in all social media, whether it's Twitter or Facebook, the spread within houses of worship, and how then the church responds to that. And so I just wanted to start off with that one and that post that you had, and how the response, and how does the church use social media, and are we using it to our benefit so that we're plugging into society, or because of social media, are we being pushed out? And so, Tony, what do you think about that?
Absolutely. No, thank you for the invitation to join you guys. I think in reflecting on that social media post, so to give some context for our listeners in regards to that article, there's this church in Eastern Oregon of about 300-ish members, and 2/3 of their members were tested positive for COVID-19 in early June. So it was either they had COVID or they had the antibodies for COVID. And so I posted that article with the intention as just a warning that, man, we may be seeing the curve flattening, but as church leaders and as church members, we still need to stay vigilant. Yes, we have the Holy Spirit, but sometimes a hedge of protection doesn't protect against COVID-19. And then also as an encouragement that, man, we're in this together. That's not just isolated churches who have to hunker down, but as the church, we're all experiencing the effects and ramifications of COVID. The responses I got from it were not shocking, but in some ways discouraging, because it ranged so far along the spectrum of responses, from people saying, man, yeah, we need to continue to stay in place and practice quarantine and social distancing, all the way to the other end of the spectrum of, man, this is a leftist agenda, this is propaganda, that I need to stop listening to NPR and CNN and just the liberal media. The irony was the article that I posted was from a right-wing conservative news outlet who was reporting this. And so I just, I think as a church member and as a church leader, I'm finding myself wanting to steward the body well, to be faithful to the commission that God's given me as a pastor, and to also not put the church in jeopardy. And so, yeah, the tension of that is it spiritual jeopardy, or is it physical, medical jeopardy? Where am I leaning? And so I think that's the landmine that I found myself stepping on. So it's been quite the case study, theological and ethical case study, just seeing the way that COVID has prompted the church to respond. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, Tony, thanks for sharing that, man. And thanks for the post. And that article, I read it just a moment ago, and that's scary. And I think we wrestle between just that fear of the possibility of becoming ill and the depths of what that could be, in contrast to what you said earlier, the power of the Holy Spirit and being Christians that believe that God can protect us against things like this, and say, hey, I'm now gonna not go to church, I'm not gonna gather together because I'm afraid of getting sick. That's a weird tension to be in. But at the same token, I think that this time in particular has really touched into why do we gather as a church? Who are we as Christians, as a church, as a local congregation? Is our connection solely the 2 hours on Sunday, the 1 hour a week Bible study, or is there something deeper going there? And I think that's wrestled with a lot of, that has been part of the wrestle during this time as well. Can we stay connected, or reconnected other than just the 2 hours on Sunday? So it's a weird tension to live in. And yeah, it's a really a time for the church to realize what is our relationship to one another. So
Yeah, do you think so for each of you, like for our church here, we've been doing it live on Facebook. So social media has been playing significantly into how the church is communicating, and now they're wrestling with opening up here in California. Like the restrictions have been put on, but then taken off, and so the churches are kind of confused, and so they've been using the social media to communicate. And I wonder too, like you were saying, Phil, like, okay, so how is it that we're supposed to gather? Do we have to be in person and everything? And do you think like the likes of Facebook, Instagram, tweeting helps out that? Because with your posting, Tony, it was interesting how people will go back and forth, and by the end, I mean, you had a pretty peaceful and ironic conversation with a couple of them. A couple of the folks that maybe started out saying it was kind of a hoax, which I don't know what a hoax is, because at least it's a pretty big hoax if these numbers, even if they're half of what the numbers are. But with social media, do you think with today's culture, is it allowing for us to feel that connection, or is it pushing us away because it's a pseudo connection?
Yeah, I'll start. I think with technology, so speaking from a like Protestant perspective, because there are things in place for the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church theologically that that shapes their church and their body. And so I think speaking from a Protestant perspective, and then from an evangelical perspective, our churches are kind of isolated or cut off from each other. There isn't an accountability per se that we have to one another, or a tradition, or a point of common identification other than we're churches. And so when it comes to social media, there's not really or when it comes to technology, there's not really a tradition that helps us govern how we use technology. I think when we taught it like anecdotally, we look at the earlier church, we look at the earliest church, and we see with the epistles, it being passed on using technology. So it used to be oral tradition, and then with the development of papyri and things being written down, you see this emergence of new technology. And so the early church began to write down letters, and then it passed on. But you still see the writers of the New Testament say, man, I long to be with you. And so in place of me not being with you, here is my letter to you along with the messenger that I've sent. So we can map that and say there's this development of technology, and in place of me not being with you, this technology is an extension of my presence.
Yeah.
But there still is not a denial of, man, we need to be together in person. And so I think we see that today. Okay, a pandemic happened. There is a reason why we can't be together physically. But in place of us being together physically, and in anticipation of us being together physically, this technology will have to do. But I haven't heard of any church or any leader saying, let's just use technology from now on, or we're just going to plug in and never unplug. And so I wonder when people say, man, technology in the virtual church has taken over. I'm like, I haven't heard of a pastor or a church leader or congregation saying this is the only way forward. So yeah.
Yeah, and I'm gonna have a quick. Oh, go ahead, Matt. You're gonna follow up there.
No, I was gonna just say, I wonder, like with the social media not taking over, satellite campuses that project, so it's not per se social media, but their satellite campuses. So the main campus is one, and then they spread out where then they just telecast. Is that a form of social media possibly taking over, you know?
Yeah, I mean, so we see that really within like the emergent church movement. But I think what we've seen is people's methodology, their missional practice has caught up with their ecclesiology. And so churches that were doing simulcast have begun to move towards autonomous church bodies, or at least a network or a family of churches. And I think the most at the forefront of those churches are like Redeemer from Tim Keller, formerly Tim Keller, where they were simulcast and then they moved to, or if they were one church with many locations, they moved to autonomous bodies. And then the Village Church with Matt Chandler in Texas, where they were definitely simulcast, and then they moved to autonomous bodies. And so I think there are movements away from simulcast towards autonomous local bodies. But I just don't see simulcast being replacing the physical gathering.
Yeah, and I do wonder how many churches are having that conversation at the moment, as we're seeing where there's churches who are broadcasting on Facebook, broadcasting on YouTube, and the like, and yeah, they're having people connect from far across the country and across the world where they don't necessarily would have had that opportunity if it was solely in the local church. So that element of being able to broadcast, I think that there's going to be some serious conversations about how much of that is going to be here to stay. And you'll have that as an option. But with what you mentioned a moment ago, Tony, just with the desire of us wanting to be together, it's like, yeah, that's always a real thing. We always want that connection. That's something that the church has always given us. But to broaden this conversation just a little bit, social media and society. I know all of us use Facebook. I imagine that that we have friends that we haven't connected from since middle school and high school that are Facebook friends now that we're able to connect with just a little bit. So societal overall, do you think that social media is plugging us into one another or is pushing us further away from one another?
Yeah, I think that's a great question because people will feel connected, you know, through the Facebook, and yay, like even today on my news feed, you know, I was reading through Facebook and seeing congratulations from babies being born to wedding anniversaries to, you know, someone passed a test for a new job or certification. And so there's a way to celebrate with them communally. But I wonder though, if that celebration then somewhat takes away from us feeling like we need to be with each other physically, you know? And so I think it's a great question. I think you find pockets. That's why I found it interesting with the Facebook post from Tony that depending on someone's trajectory, they're pushing for what they believe it's a hoax or don't believe it's a hoax, the need to, I guess, be together, you know? And going back to the early church, you'll hear people talk about, oh, we are connected with the saints that have gone before us. So and we're not going to be in their presence until heaven, is there still a presence because of the spirit, the one bodiness, you know? And so going back to your point too, Phil, like it is the socializing on Facebook making us feel as though we are still connected, and yet there's still something within us that says, I know we're not really connected. And so I think in light of the COVID-19 and health issues, there's going to come a point where people have to go, wait, how much do I need to be in the presence of people who can I worship with you guys by this way, you know, Zoom or Skype or, you know, Google Hangout? Is that truly worship, or do we have to be in each other's presence regardless of first century? If they got in each other's presence, the COVID-19 was the Roman rulers, right? I mean, they were under persecution, and there's churches in China and other parts of the world where they meet together and they're under the threat of death, you know, and so they still get together. So I think, how do you do that? Because on Facebook, you might feel like we're connected, and yet you still are not truly, you know, in the present. So I think it's a great question is how does social media make us feel like we're connected or make us feel like we're pushing one another apart?
Yeah, I think that question, I want to add to that question and like add to that tension, because in some ways, I think we center that question, and I'm not saying you're centering that, Phil, but I think when I've heard that question, I've heard it centered a lot around a certain experience or context for the church. But what we often overlook is how that question has always been asked, just of different communities. And to put that plainly, when we look at our brothers and sisters who are differently abled, so when we talk about social media, we talk about it in a very ableist way. We center the narrative around certain conditions that we're unaware of. And so in broadening that question, we look at our brothers and sisters who have limited mobility, our brothers and sisters who don't have the same access that we do, who rely on technology and social media for their community. They've been having to deal with these theological and ethical questions long before we've had to deal with it because of COVID, but we just center the conversation around us and our experience and our ableness. And so I feel oftentimes the majority church always arrives at the question so late because the minority church has been having to deal with these questions. And we disregard our brothers and sisters who are differently abled because it doesn't concern us. And so with social media, I often feel like it's a red herring, or it's like non sequitur. Like, that's not the point, because our brothers and sisters who aren't able to meet with us on a weekly basis because of their bodily impairments, or their cognitive impairments, they've been having to wrestle with these questions. And for us as local church leaders and as theologians, we haven't been putting our theological weight there because it hasn't affected us. But these are real questions that people have been struggling with and struggling through. And so maybe that isn't the answer that our listeners would want, but I'm trying to broaden it and say, man, there is a wealth and a fountain there. And just because we're dealing with it now doesn't mean that this point of tension hasn't existed before.
Yeah, it goes back to Phil and I were just having a talk yesterday in one of these episodes that's coming up for New Wine Uncorked on the racial tension. Some people in the church feel like, oh my gosh, look at this now. And those, whether they're in the minority or majority of the church, there's people of brown and black color have been like, the racial tension has been there, the racial issues. And so I totally take to your point that the majority of the church, and we're talking, church leaders way up here tend to, the strange thing is are disconnected, and with the social media, I wonder too, I've been pushing this idea that one of the things that we're missing out on today's culture of the church or even society is ageism. I mean, I know we have the isms, but one of the things that I don't know if is being addressed is this continued age gap. We've got we love labeling. My son he just gets so irritated. He's like, why do we always have to label each other, and categorize people? I'm not in this category, and because he sees, his generation, he's just finished high school. And he's like, but why aren't I able to speak into older generations? Because we label. And social media seems like one of those things where we see one of the biggest disconnects where for him, social media, Twitter, online, Discord, all that stuff, Twitch, that's the way they communicate. Like some of the discussions that these guys have in their rooms while they're gaming, their chat rooms, it's pretty profound. And I'm like, they're connecting. And yet when my folks walk in and they're, oh, well, you just game. What do you, it's just, they don't really see it as this social interaction. I'm like, dude, these guys, there's just a lot going on. These, students or older folks, I guess, everyone is gamers, they're gaming, but then they're also cognitively thinking on these levels. They're talking ethics, they're talking politics, they're talking and pushing each other's limits because it's usually international too. So I wonder too, how we're missing out possibly with the discussion of social media on how can we use this as a gap? I mean, bridging the gap that's between, those of us who are online all the time and those of us who, gosh, we go Facebook. Oh, I have, 4 friends and I look at it, once every 6 months, so it's like even that too. So how does the church continue to embrace it? Because we've all dealt with the church leadership, mostly with, youth, and how it is trying to bridge the gap between our youth services and how we minister to the youth, whatever age that is. And then folks that are getting older, So I think social media is one of those ways where maybe the church isn't harnessing what we have in front of us, because we're just the unknown. When I talk to folks from church leadership and we talk about internet, inevitably it goes to the negative uses of internet. And what about the positives? I mean, look at us right now. We're able to have this dialogue, each of us 3 different areas, and yet it's going to be broadcast out and getting people in multiple states going, oh, because there's still something similar to us in our church context, right? If we're all created in the image of a relational God who pours out love. So it seems like we would need the same things.
Absolutely.
And then with that, and so you both are going on, I was able to go for the extended studies and go beyond the master's, and you guys are both pursuing your further grad degrees and everything. And Phil, one of the things you're looking at is this idea of the church, and being pushed out of the margins. How does the social media impact the church in that area? Is it pushing the church more out, to be divided, or is it allowing the church to plug into one another, do you think?
Interesting. Couple of things. First, with one of the things that have happened in Portland for a long time is just, and you guys kind of see this by and large, but it's been more significant, I think, here, is the fact that you have pastors that are just well known in the area. We have, like Mark Strong at Life Change, or Dr. Bethel at Maranatha Church, and these men, their word carries a lot of weight, and to not have the opportunity to be able to hear from them is in particular at a time like this is difficult. So those pastors being able to use social media to be able to share. And when I'm saying this time, I'm talking about COVID, and then the inception of, in the middle of it, we have Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd happening. And we need leaders to be able to speak into this kind of time and to be able to just give hope and vision in the middle of this time. And so a lot of these pastors have been using social media to have a message, to be able to speak into these things. Now, in addition to it, of course, we've had our protests that have happened, our rallies that have happened in Portland significantly over the past little bit, if I'm not mistaken, every day since George Floyd's murder. There have been a rally going on in downtown Portland every day since then. So having the people that can speak into this time has been able to use social media to do just that. But it has not escaped the fact that we are actually still meeting together, are actually still being able to hear, are actually still being able to get together and sing in the middle of these rallies and the like, to give one another hope as we're doing this. So.
Yeah, I think with churches who feel like they're being pushed out, I think it's more of a perception than an actual being pushed out. I think the church within the United States experiences tremendous privileges and benefits that it's unaware of. I think the church in the United States experiences complacency and a complicitness. Like when we think about, if we were just to do a tracing of the megachurch movement, we cannot divorce it from the gentrification and the redlining of Black communities and ethnic communities. So when a suburb moves in, who is being displaced for that suburb to be birthed? And so when a megachurch is formed in that city, in that area, what land is it being built on? Because that land used to be expensive and then it became cheap. At what cost? And so I think with technology, churches need to be aware of power dynamics. They need to be aware of what is really at threat and at cost, because I think oftentimes churches shun technology because they feel like it's a theological or a missional drift. But in reality, what it's threatening is it's threatening a certain cultural hold that the church has and that the church needs to reframe or rethink. And maybe the church is calcified in that area. And we can map this socially. Like when Luther nails his theses on the door, there is a technological innovation that the Roman Catholic Church has to come to terms with. For us as, Protestant churches with our mini popes, we are coming to a reckoning with a technological innovation that is making us question our power structures. And I think the more people reject technology without interrogating it, they're doing more harm to themselves and the communities they're trying to reach out to. Because I think technology is a tool, and we shouldn't shun the tool. We should look to steward the tool. And oftentimes when we scapegoat the tool, we ignore the problems that are inherent within our communities, and we ignore our histories. So whether it's the technology of the megachurch, the innovation of the megachurch, that is a technology. Where did that technology come from? So I would say I don't think we're being pushed out, especially within the United States. The church, we are not in a post-Christian society. We're entering into a post-Christendom society where the structures of the church are decaying and rotting from the inside out. And we're beginning to see that rot. The church has to come to a time of reckoning with that. But the church is still very much in power. Just look at our current presidency. Just look at evangelicalism. The church is not being persecuted. The church is doing the persecuting in some respect, in some regard.
Let's to add into what you just said, and to I'm gonna come with that a little bit. I am looking at the church now in light of what you just said, in light of the presidency, and like, do you feel that the church has lost like just the ability to speak into the good of society? Societal good, that in many regards, as I mentioned earlier, having voices of pastors who have constantly been a part of struggles in the city of Portland. Do we want preachers being at rallies, talking to society in large? Talking to their church is one thing, but talking to society by and large, because of the connection to evangelicalism and how we're connected to structural powers and the like, do we still want pastors to be able to speak into these issues, or we'll take some and not take others? What do you guys think there?
Yeah, I think going back to Tony's point, like I find it funny when people talk about this post-Christian realm. I'm like, I don't know what that means. If God is all powerful and all knowing and everywhere, how can you ever be a post-Christian? But like what you're saying, Phil, certain voices sometimes get to hold the microphone, right, when speaking on the message of the church. And so with the president standing out in front of a church with the Bible, that represents the church for a lot of people, or the right conservative, I guess you want to talk when it comes to politics, it's all about the judges, constructing the system in which we live from the underbelly, the courts and the judges. If nothing else, what the Republicans have learned is how to build the infrastructure, and you do it quietly, through judges and court system. And so you point those. And so then that filters into, and it goes, what both of you said is the power structure still remains the same, I think, sometimes, because even the ones that the media highlights as speaking for the church, if they're not a prominent name, I mean, I think it absolutely sucks that it takes the murder of a Black man to get someone like Reverend Al Sharpton more airspace and he's preaching more of the gospel at a funeral, when he's talking about the deaths and the murders of a community, the Black community. And that's the only time that we would hear from his point of view. And to build the church has to have all those voices. It has to have the Black voices, the brown voices, the white voices, the female voices, and yet does it? Because the voices that tend to speak for the church, don't they look a certain way? And the ones that are closest to the presidency, at least now, tend to come from a very narrow niche, and so social media, though, I feel like sometimes just amplifies the division when it comes to that, because how many voices have we heard from youth pastors who are in there with these 17 to 25-year-olds who really, they understand, okay, well, what's going on relationally here, especially now with COVID-19, if the numbers are true, from 18 to 49, this large growing population, who's speaking into them. And so I think, Phil, to your point, I think the microphone is still, even with social media, and you have some prominent church leaders that might not be from the mainstream, and yet it's only a handful, and they still have to be from a fairly known church, right? You're not having the pastors who regularly pastor a 70-person church. How many of them have a social media presence?
Yeah, Phil, I agree with what Matt is saying, and I think that it comes off as, yes, only some pastors should be speaking and other people should take a break. But I think when we investigate that and like flesh that out, what we're saying is it's not that we don't want everybody speaking, but it's that some people have always been speaking and they need to share the mic. Because if Joel is true and God is pouring out his spirit on sons and daughters, and young people are prophesying and old people are dreaming dreams, man, everybody has something to contribute to the conversation. But some people have been writing anthologies while other people are just coming to putting words to paper and pen. And so I think to speak like forthrightly in terms of race, like in terms of the civil rights movement, in regards to the response to the murder of George Floyd, like we need to listen to the Black church, and not only listen, but to follow the Black church. And so in Portland, we need to be following the lead of pastors like Mark Strong and Eric Knox and Leroy Barber. Like we need to be following their lead. But oftentimes, to put it bluntly, our white brothers and sisters are like, wow, are you saying that like I don't get to speak? Like I thought we're all made in the image of God. And it's like, no, we are, but it's you've had access. It's a question or a problem of access. It's not a question or a problem of equity or equality, but it's equality in practice, which is access. And so I think yeah, some of our brothers and sisters need to stop speaking and follow different leaders for the time being, because yeah, it's a question of authority and who has the power and who has access to the structures, who's building the structures, who's controlling the structures. It's not a question of, are you a good person or a bad person? We're not trying to make those arguments. I think those arguments are non sequitur, and it's a distraction from the real issue at hand.
Hey, let me add one more thing in here, kind of there's something I want to get at. Let me pose it this way: do you want to hear from a pastor in the middle of all this? Is a question. I mean, is a question. Is that who you even want the mic to go to? I mean, in light of all the stuff we're talking about, in light of these power structures and the like, just today, is that the voice that gives you hope in the middle of all this? Or I don't want to answer the question for you. Go ahead. Any of you guys?
Yeah, I mean, I think the problem is deep inside, people want to say, yes, I want to hear, especially if they're a Christian, because they think they should want to hear from their pastor. The issue that I have is, but what pastor is able to actually speak into this because they have actually been humble enough and willing enough to step back and actually receive other leaders? And so I been talking to Metzger about this a little bit, and this idea that the white pastor or the white leader needs to speak out so as to give voice to the voiceless, uh, African American churches or Chinese churches or the minority, is kind of a, again, it plays into that social construct that in order for the black and brown to be risen up and raised up, it must come from the white culture to get underneath them. And so then when you say, so you want to hear from a pastor, well, it's always too many of the people that look like me, saying, oh, well, here's how we help our black and brown brothers and sisters. And so then you go, why are you always talking though? Why do you think that you have the, and so, yes, I want to hear from pastors, but the problem that I have is the pastoral voice that keeps coming out is the same, voice of reconciliation and relationship, but that's just a masking for really the power structure underneath, and so then I go, I don't need to keep hearing from these same, they're saying the same thing. They're just using neat, fluffy language, because how do they know the situation of all when it's always them talking and they're not willing to share the pulpit with others that don't look like them, that don't sound like them, So I want to say yes, Phil, but my gut says, not the pastors that we currently have is holding the mic.
Yeah, I think within Protestantism, within the country, for us to speak contextually, I think we always need to hear from pastors because it's through pastors that God proclaims his word. God uses pastors to proclaim his word. But I think in our current setting, pastors need to be held accountable. And I think God has been raising up prophetic voices outside of the church to confront the church. I think pastors, if I were to indict us, I think for too long we've been gorging on God's flock. I think the Old Testament is true when it says God's shepherds have been feeding on his flock. I think the indictment of the New Testament is so true in that the leaders of the community of faith have begun to eat and become full on God's people, and we need to be held accountable. And so, of course, we always need to hear from pastors, but I think pastors need to be held accountable today. And there are voices within the church and from outside of the church that are calling pastors to account, but the pastors are using their voices to suppress the very prophets that God's been raising up.
Yeah, and we'll move on in a second. I just one more thing with just as a comment. That's scary, right? Where literally we have people sick and dying. We have cities on fire, and we're looking around saying, I don't know if I want the man or woman of God to come and speak to this because I already know what you're gonna say. That's scary. Yeah, and that's, to me, that adds into this. So when I read a story like that you posted, or just all the different things, the pastors in Arizona that constructed the system that killed most of COVID, so they thought, or whatever they said in their follow-up statement. Just thinking of all those things, and then the depictions of when you see Christians in just TV shows and whatnot, and the images they choose to depict. It's scary to think that, okay, when the church comes to bear on something like this is not the voice of hope. This is not the prophetic voice. Maybe it is at times, but we already know what you guys are going to say. So just say it and get it over with so we can move on to the real business. That's scary. That's common. All right, we can move on.
No, I think you're right, dude. And I think the way forward is the question, right? That's why we need to continue to dialogue. I feel like the pastors that I want to be listen to, and I want to have speaking into my life, are the ones that are willing to step back and say, maybe we've messed up. It's the indictment that you're talking about, Tony, the willingness to look in and say, I need to repent of my will to power, if you want to bring Nietzsche into it, this idea, because I feel like we're living out like this, in the Grand Inquisitor that Dostoevsky writes, is that they just throw the breadcrumbs at the people and just keep them satisfied. And I feel like that's what we've learned to do within the church, going back to your point of complacency, right? Which is a great topic to take up. And this is what we're going to do for the next time, to leave it at that, because then people are going to be like, well, wait a minute, what's the answer? So this is what we'll do is, I'm going to read this quotation. It's going to be at the bottom of this video in the description. And in the next couple of days, when Tony, Phil, and I get back together, we're going to take this up. This is what theologian William Cavanaugh said. He writes that the Eucharistic community, the church is the Eucharistic community, speaking of eating and filling up, right? So the Eucharistic community, which participates in the life of the triune God, who is the only good that can be common to all. Its reality is global and eternal, anticipating the heavenly polity on earth. So for our next chat, and I'll put it again, for our viewers to see, they can sort of mull over this and chew on it. What does it mean for the church to be Eucharistic, self-giving, and to be the body of Christ, to be broken in the midst of, Tony, I think you brought up, in a consumeristic society that seeks to just consume and devour the other? And so the next episode, when we get together, the three of us, we'll do this. For those of you that are watching right now, this is going to be a continual thing where church leaders, pastors, each one of us pastored and teaching in the higher education at the university, as well as going on degrees. So we've got that wonderful connection between the higher ed, those that are raising up and teaching church leaders, as well as each one of us leading in the church, right? So to have this constant communication and dialogue to understand who the church is, right? So we totally appreciate you guys joining us today on New Wine Uncorked. Tony Huyhn and Phil Berlin, and I'm Matt Farlow, and this is New Wine Uncorked. Be sure to go right there underneath us and hit subscribe, so that the next time that we go for another episode, which we've got the question in front of us, we're going to be chewing on this in the next couple of days. The Eucharistic community and the church, because is the church plugging into one another, or are we pushing each other out? So for Tony, for Phil, awesome seeing you guys. This is New Wine Uncorked. Till we see you on the flip side.
Peace.